Mars, the story of a hidden empire. Imagine a boy who, due to polio, could not run with the others. He sat in the kitchen, stirring caramel, never suspecting that he would one day birth a family saga that is still shrouded in silence and secrecy today. Mars is one of the largest private companies in the world. It is a giant that earns more than Coca-Cola, yet we know almost nothing about the people who own it. They do not appear in the media. They do not give interviews. Most of their success was created behind closed doors. And yet, it all started with an outsider with crippled legs, and his son, who fled to Europe, learned to make chocolate in Switzerland, and built his own empire in England. This is not just a story about chocolate. This is a story about secrecy, ambition, and the rise of the most hidden dynasty in the food world. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Couldn't Run. Frank Clarence Mars was born in 1883 in the northern United States, in a harsh environment where inclement weather was as taken for granted as the necessity of hard work for survival. Unlike his peers, however, Frank never fully fit into this rhythm. Soon after birth, he contracted polio, a disease that permanently weakened his legs and condemned him to the role of an observer. While other boys ran, climbed trees, or skated on the frozen river, Frank remained sitting on the sidelines. The world of children, usually full of carefreeness, became a place of isolation for him, which shapes human character more deeply than we are willing to admit. He understood very early on that his path through life would not be physical, but mental. Where the body fell short, the mind had to take over. It was at this moment that his mother, Elva, entered his story, deciding to bridge the gap between her son and the outside world with what she herself mastered perfectly, making sweets. She took the small boy into the kitchen and, at the countertop, initiated him into the alchemy of mixing sugar, watching temperatures, and recognizing the exact moment the mixture was ready. For Frank, however, this wasn't just about gaining a skill. It was the first system he understood, and in which he didn't have to compare himself to anyone. He could create, and for the first time in his life, he could be truly good at something. When he grew up, he tried to turn this skill into a livelihood, but his beginnings were lined with a series of failures. Frank Mars belonged to those people who faced bankruptcy in their careers more often than is common. He founded small businesses, making candies and caramels, but every time he hit the same obstacles, low margins, expensive inputs, poor location, or lack of capital, his life resembled a constant cycle of hard work, minor success, and subsequent fall. Yet he had one unusual quality: he never stopped. Even in moments when he lived with his second wife so modestly that their kitchen served as a factory and the living room as a warehouse, he continued on. Frank manufactured, his wife packed, and together they offered their products around town. It was a small business, but an honest one. During this period, his son Forrest was born, whose nature would fundamentally determine the direction of the entire lineage in the future. While Frank was quiet, conciliatory, and patient, Forrest represented his complete opposite. Even as a child, he was restless, stubborn, and unyielding, traits that over time became his driving engine. He wanted more from life than the world offered him, and certainly more than his father dared to imagine. Their natures missed each other, and later they were to clash even more loudly than their business visions. Frank's true innovation came only when he had more falls behind him than others have in a lifetime. The idea for the Milky Way bar was born, built on a simple reasoning: to offer customers a lot of value for little money, a sweet that felt more luxurious than it actually was. The composition was simple: nougat, caramel, and chocolate. But the whole worked perfectly. Milky Way was large, sweet, attractive, and cheap to produce. This time, it was not a flop. Frank finally had a product that sold, and the earnings allowed him to build his first truly functional factory. Although he decorated it more than was practical, which Forrest later criticized, it meant a huge life shift for Frank, and proof that he had finally succeeded. While Milky Way conquered the market, Forrest studied and gathered experience in business management. When he returned home, he saw his father for the first time as a successful entrepreneur, but at the same time, as a person who, in his opinion, ran the company poorly. Forrest immediately began pushing for modernization and expansion, while Frank, who had only just begun to enjoy peace after years of hardship, yearned for stability. Conflict was inevitable. This tension between a man who learned to survive and a young man who desired to dominate was to forever determine the future of their name. Chapter 2: A Family Rift and the Journey Across the Ocean. The success of the Milky Way bar opened doors for Frank that had remained closed to him for most of his life. After dozens of failures, he held in his hands a product that sold almost by itself, and with rising revenues came not only capital, but also the hitherto unknown space to think about the future. Paradoxically, it was at the moment of triumph that the chasm destined to divide the Mars family began to widen. Forrest returned home from his studies transformed. He was more ambitious, purposeful, and harder. Instead of admiration for what his father had achieved, a feeling prevailed in him that it was still not enough, and never would be, unless Frank stopped running the company as an extension of his home kitchen. Frank claimed victory, but Forrest saw only wasted opportunities and the inefficiency of his father's factory, which was too ornamental and family-style for his taste. While Frank built buildings resembling small palaces because he could finally afford it after a life full of self-denial, Forrest calculated, planned, and uncompromisingly reduced. The essence of their conflict was not just commercial, but deeply personal. Frank wanted to enjoy the fruits of his lifelong work, while Forrest wanted to risk and expand. What began with subtle hints quickly turned into direct clashes. The son saw the father as a weak leader. The father saw the son as an ungrateful maximalist. Their life philosophies diverged so much that mutual accommodation was no longer possible. In a desperate attempt at compromise, Forrest pushed through the relocation of part of the production to Chicago, which offered better access to raw materials and more experienced workers, thanks to its strong background in the confectionery industry. Chicago became their joint project, but also their last one. The way Forrest ran the business was ruthless. While Frank built the company on loyalty and relationships, Forrest introduced systems, controls, and aggressive pressure on performance. Where the father focused on aesthetics and personal comfort, the son saw unnecessary luxury and error. The conflict grew beyond bearable limits. When it became clear that the gap between father and son was unbridgeable, Forrest did the only thing his nature allowed. He left. However, he did not leave quietly or conciliatorily, but with a cold determination to build something of his own, something that would not be burdened by his father's sentimentality. While Frank was a man of craft and feeling, Forrest was a man of iron discipline and insatiable ambition. Their shared world had been bursting at the seams for a long time, and at the moment of the definitive break, nothing remained to hold it together. Forrest's path to building an empire did not lead straight to founding a new factory, but to carefully planned industrial espionage. In 1933, he moved with his family to Switzerland, the cradle of the finest European chocolate, realizing that if he wanted to dominate, he had to master what his father and Hershey in America only guessed at, the true science behind manufacturing. He was not content with theoretical knowledge. He got himself hired as an ordinary worker in the most prestigious factories of the time, first at Jean Tobler's, maker of Toblerone, and subsequently directly at the giant Nestlé. What is key, he did not reveal his identity to anyone. He worked on the lines incognito, observed machines, studied the chemical processes of conching and tempering, and absorbed know-how that was a strictly guarded secret at the time. While his American competitors often made chocolate by trial and error, Forrest wanted to understand every molecule. He was guided by a conviction that became his lifelong credo. You can hire lawyers, accountants, and advertising experts, but if you want to get rich, you have to know how to make the product. You can never hire someone to do it for you to make you rich. That person will always do it only for themselves. Only when he felt he had uncovered the secrets of the Swiss masters did he move to England to use this knowledge against those who had unwittingly taught him. He chose Slough, an industrial town far from his father's influence, where he could start with a clean slate. The conditions were harsh. He settled his family in a small, cold apartment directly above a rented workshop. The children shared a single room. The walls shook under the weight of passing trains, and the pervasive cold became their unwanted roommate. Forrest, however, did not see discomfort in this, but an opportunity to build a company from scratch, without compromise, and exactly according to his rules. Because he could not use the name Milky Way here, he had to improvise. He took the recipe he knew from home and adapted it for British tastes, adding more sugar and reducing the chocolate. The result was a bar he named simply and confidently, the Mars Bar. To start production, he pragmatically allied with the competition. Cadbury supplied him with chocolate. From nothing, he built his own distribution network and established a regime where every minute and every movement on the line was subject to the dictates of efficiency. The Mars Bar became a hit. For Forrest, it was a turning point. For the first time, he experienced success that was not overshadowed by his father's name. It was the success of a man who had fought for everything himself. But Forrest's ambition did not end with sugar. In 1935, while the Mars Bar was conquering British shelves, he took a step that seemed completely crazy at the time. He bought a small company, Chappell Brothers, which made canned dog food. At that time, it was an absurd idea. Dogs ate leftovers from the table. No one spent money on feeding them. Forrest, however, saw the future earlier than others. He understood that industrialization would change households and that people would want comfort and standards for their pets. It was a genius move. Dog food, later known as the brands Chappie and Pedigree, was not as flashy as chocolate, but it had one fundamental quality. It generated huge amounts of cash. And it was this money that allowed Forrest to finance further expansion without having to beg bankers. This experience transformed him. When he later returned to America, he was no longer the rebellious son, but a respected and feared industrialist. Meanwhile, Frank was aging in America, and his company, though still growing, was losing its breath without his son's ferocity. Father and son thus became symbols of two different worlds that could have achieved the impossible together, had the price of cooperation not been too high for both. Their separation was thus not just the end of a whole family, but the beginning of two empires. Chapter 3: Magic Marbles That Did Not Melt. When Forrest Mars returned to the United States after years spent in England, he did not arrive as a prodigal son. He arrived as a man who had built a reputation outside his father's shadow. In Britain, he had managed to produce a product that conquered the market and mastered the hard know-how of production management, understanding that true growth requires the rejection of comfortable stability. His return took place in 1939, when the world was uncontrollably heading into war chaos. But Forrest was convinced that crisis brings new opportunities, and he was not mistaken. He brought inspiration from Europe, where he had noticed Spanish soldiers eating small chocolate lentils coated with a hard sugar crust. These little balls did not melt in the heat, did not stain pockets, and were ideal for transport. For Forrest, this was not just a sweet, but a brilliant functional concept for extreme conditions. Chocolate that doesn't melt. He knew, however, that for mass production he needed a strong partner, and that partner was the giant Hershey. Forrest's visit to the Hershey factory was carefully thought out. He did not aim for Milton Hershey himself, who was more devoted to charity at the time, but for William Murray, the company president who effectively ran the firm. Forrest did not go to beg, he went to offer. At the meeting, he simply poured a handful of chocolate lentils onto the table and declared, "I had them in my pocket all day, and they didn't melt." This stark presentation was enough, but Forrest's proposal was even bolder. He proposed founding a new company where he himself would hold 80% and offer the remaining 20% to Murray's son, Bruce. Why would the powerful director of Hershey agree to such a disadvantageous deal? The reason was simple. William Murray was merely an employee. The Hershey company was owned by a trust, and he had no share to bequeath to his family. Partnership with Mars was the only way to secure his son a business and assets of his own. And so the firm Mars and Murray, M&M's, was born. For Forrest, this was a strategic masterpiece. Bruce Murray was not just a partner, he was the key to raw materials. At a time when war was approaching and chocolate was rationed, thanks to his father, he had secured priority access to supplies from Hershey and exclusive contacts with army purchasers. World War II became the perfect accelerator for M&M's. the product got into the ration packs of American soldiers, which ensured huge production volumes and created a future civilian market full of returning veterans with a built-in habit for this sweet. While other manufacturers struggled during the war, Forrest's firm grew stronger. The war, however, did not open doors for Forrest only in chocolate. At the same time, he came across a British chemist who had developed a revolutionary method of processing rice called parboiling. Thanks to it, the rice did not stick, lasted longer, retained nutritional values, and most importantly, pests did not spoil it. This was exactly what the Army needed for supplies in the Pacific. Forrest did not hesitate. He founded another company in Houston and did something no one had considered possible until then. He took an ordinary commodity, poured it into a box with a portrait of a smiling older man, and gave it a name, Uncle Ben's. It was the first branded rice in the world, and just like with M&Ms, the war and government contracts helped him build an empire here that would have taken decades to create in peacetime. In the background of success, however, tension was growing. The post-war transition to the civilian market was not easy, and sales stalled at first. The partnership with Bruce Murray began to creak. Bruce was mild and thoughtful, which did not stand up in confrontation with the toxic and uncompromising management style that Forrest created. Forrest, however, timed his attack with cold precision. He waited until the moment William Murray retired from the leadership of Hershey. At that moment, Bruce lost his protective shield and ceased to be useful to Forrest. Forrest began to exert unbearable pressure on his partner. He reportedly marked Bruce's reports with a red "failed" stamp and posted them on doors, and even on toilets, for all employees to see. In 1949, deprived of his influential father and exhausted by constant conflicts, Bruce left the company. Forrest bought him out and took 100% control over M&Ms. Now that M&Ms were exclusively his, Forrest decided to build a strong story around the brand that would stand up even in peacetime. In 1950, he hired the advertising agency Ted Bates & Company, which conducted the first in-depth consumer behavior research in the company's history, a step completely unheard of in the conservative confectionery industry of that time. The results revealed an interesting paradox. M&Ms were loved primarily by children, who appreciated the bright colors and small size, but the money to buy them was in the hands of their parents. Forrest and his team, therefore, had to come up with a way to convince adults to buy the sweet for their offspring. The answer was a brilliant slogan that targeted a hidden but strong motivation of every parent: the desire for a clean household. The legendary sentence was born: "The milk chocolate that melts in your mouth, not in your hand." It wasn't just a phrase about taste. It was a pragmatic promise to parents that with this sweet, children wouldn't have sticky fingers, and chocolate wouldn't end up smeared on the furniture. They supported the campaign by sponsoring popular children's shows like the Mickey Mouse Club, thereby creating a perfect loop of demand. However, with the rocket growth of sales came plagiarists. The market began to fill with cheap imitations, trying to ride on M&M's success, and Forrest knew he had to aggressively protect his original. Therefore, he introduced the technologically demanding printing of the letter M directly onto each individual lentil. At first, they used black ink, but in 1954, they switched to the iconic white color, which was more visible. This M was not just a decoration. It was a defensive rampart and a seal of quality. Advertisements began to instruct customers to look for the M on every piece as the only proof of authenticity. M&Ms thus became not only an icon, but also protected intellectual property, which secured Forrest a tool for endless growth. After the death of his father Frank, who was sick and tired at the end of his life, Forrest became the key figure of the entire lineage. With typical hardness, he began to transform the original family firm into a global, closed empire with a single goal: to have absolute control over the entire chain from raw materials to sales. What Frank built with heart as a livelihood, Forrest turned into an extremely efficient machine, to whose rise, paradoxically, one small, originally wartime sweet contributed the most. Chapter 4: When the Kingdom of Sweets Found New Realms. When Forrest Mars fully took control of the family business, the world no longer resembled the time when his father learned to cook caramel in the kitchen. The company had transformed from a workshop into an industrial colossus, and the brand had outgrown the boundaries of the local market. Forrest, a man obsessed with structure, felt he was only at the beginning, and unlike his father's intuition, he believed that success required leaving nothing to chance. He immediately began changing the company's DNA. He banned interviews, limited media access, and withdrew the company from the public space. Silence was not a barrier for him, but a strategic advantage that allowed him to make decisions without having to answer to shareholders or reveal cards to the competition. While other companies invested in PR, Mars became an invisible fortress. While Forrest consolidated his control over production, his main competitor, Hershey, got caught in the trap of its own tradition. Since 1900, a bar of Hershey's chocolate had cost exactly 5 cents. It was a sacred cow, a price that had not been touched for almost 70 years. But the economy is relentless, and inflation took its toll. Hershey solved it in a way that was inconspicuous for a long time, but devastating. They didn't raise the price, but they shrank the bar. Year after year, the bar was thinner and lighter, until by the end of the 60s, only half of the original weight remained. In 1969, it could go on no longer. Cocoa prices skyrocketed, and Hershey management had to take an unpopular step. They raised the price to 10 cents. To appease customers, they returned the bar to its original size. Economically, it made sense, but psychologically, it was a disaster. Customers didn't see a return to honest weight. They saw that the price doubled overnight, and moreover, they realized how much the company had been cheating them on size for decades. Forrest Mars smelled blood. Thanks to making his own chocolate now, he could attack, and his weapon was simple: mass. Mars had a huge advantage over Hershey in the composition of its products. Bars like Snickers or Milky Way are full of nougat and peanuts, ingredients that are significantly cheaper than the pure cocoa butter that forms the base of a Hershey bar. Forrest could thus offer customers a bar that was visually larger, heavier, and more filling, while producing it at lower costs. Mars launched an aggressive campaign. While Hershey raised prices and stumbled, Mars increased the size of its bars without moving the price. Customers, sensitive to inflation, voted with their wallets. They wanted a piece of food for their money, not a thin slab of chocolate. The result came in 1973. In this turning point year, the Mars company surpassed Hershey for the first time in history and became the largest confectionery company in the United States. It was a victory of pragmatism over tradition, a victory from which Hershey never fully recovered in the American market. When Forrest Mars handed over the reign of the empire to his children in 1973 and retired, it seemed the circle had closed. He was 70 years old, had built one of the largest companies in the world, and defeated all competitors. Most people would spend time golfing or on a yacht at such a moment, but Forrest only managed to rest for a few years. In 1980, at the age of 76, he began to get bored again. His answer to boredom was typical. He founded a new company. He decided to enter the premium chocolate segment and compete with the established brand See's Candies. He named his new business Ethel M. Chocolates, in honor of his mother, who had once taught him the first recipes in the kitchen. This time, however, he chose a specific niche in the market: chocolates filled with liqueur. Because alcohol sales laws were strict in the US at the time, he had to find a place where such production would be allowed. He found it in Nevada. He moved to the outskirts of Las Vegas, to Henderson, and built a new factory there. And just like in his youth in England, even now, as a billionaire, he did not change his habits. He had an apartment built directly above the production hall, so he could go downstairs any time to check the quality. Forrest's little retirement project soon became a phenomenon. Within a few years, Ethel M was generating sales of $150 million. The circle definitively closed in 1988, when the Mars Company, already managed by his children, bought this firm from their father. It was the last lesson Forrest taught them. Age doesn't matter, nor does how much money you have. If you know how to make a product people want, you can start anytime and anywhere, even in the desert at 76 years old. When Mars was rolling over the competition with strength and efficiency in the 70s, a moment came at the beginning of the new decade that reminded them that in business, there is no such thing as a definitive victory. The year was 1981, and in Hollywood, young director Steven Spielberg was finishing his new film about a small alien stranded on Earth. There was a key scene in the script. The boy, Elliot, gains the trust of the frightened creature by leaving a trail of colorful candies. The production had a clear idea of what kind of candies they should be. They wanted M&Ms. It was logical, small, colorful, iconic. The filmmakers approached the Mars company with an offer that seems like the chance of a lifetime today. But back then, it had a catch. Spielberg's people demanded that Mars invest $1 million in joint promotion in exchange for their product being in the film. Management hesitated. Perhaps they didn't like the idea of a strange alien creature eating their product, or perhaps they just didn't want to spend money on an uncertain film project. Whatever the reason, Mars said no. For the filmmakers, it was a complication, but not the end. They called Hershey. At that time, they had a product on the market called Reese's Pieces, peanut candies that were trying to compete with M&Ms, but were struggling in sales. For Hershey, it was a risk, but they had nothing to lose. They agreed to the offer. When the film E.T., the extraterrestrial, stormed cinemas, it became an instant cultural phenomenon. And with it, the orange-yellow candies the alien munched on. Sales of Reese's Pieces practically tripled overnight. Hershey, which had been losing its breath for years, suddenly got a weapon in its hands that Mars had voluntarily put aside. It was a lesson on the power of marketing that Mars headquarters had to remember for a long time. It is not enough to have the best factories and the highest efficiency. Sometimes you just need to pick up the phone and take a risk. Reese's Pieces became a staple in cinemas across America thanks to a single decision and reminded Mars that their dominance was not unshakable. In Mars production halls, products were created that became a self-evident part of culture. Snickers, Twix, Starburst, Skittles, and M&Ms became a global phenomenon after the war. Forrest, however, looked further ahead from the beginning. He realized that the confectionery market is unstable and declines first in times of crisis. Therefore, he focused his attention on an area that few considered a gold mine at the time, the world of domestic animals. It was an inconspicuous expansion. Mars began buying up smaller pet food brands at a time when an animal was more of a practical helper than a family member. Forrest, however, correctly predicted that urbanization would change people's relationship with pets and create a market with highly loyal consumption. This vision was confirmed later when Mars bought the French brand Royal Canin in 2002, gaining scientific expertise and research facilities. Thereby, the firm created a second strong leg to stand on if interest in sweets waned. Forrest's successors pushed this strategy even further when they began investing directly in veterinary care and quietly bought up networks of clinics like Banfield or VCA, creating a system of thousands of healthcare facilities. The public still perceived Mars as a chocolate manufacturer, while the company's center of gravity was shifting to pet care. The year 2008 brought a merger that shook the sweet industry. Mars bought the Wrigley Company. This transaction for $23 billion was not just an ordinary acquisition, it was one of the boldest moves in the company's history, taking place against the backdrop of a collapsing global financial market. The deal was announced in the spring, but its closing was to take place in October 2008. Exactly at the moment when the fall of Lehman Brothers plunged the world into the deepest financial crisis since the Great Depression. Mars, which historically avoided debt and banks, needed an ally this time, and they found no one lesser than legendary investor Warren Buffett and his conglomerate Berkshire Hathaway. Buffett entered the deal not only as a financier, but as a key guarantor of trust. At a time when banks stopped lending, Buffett provided Mars with capital of $6.5 billion, and his reputation helped secure the remaining financing from Goldman Sachs. His motivation was simple and stemmed from a philosophy he shared with the Mars family: buy commodities, sell brands. Wrigley was a perfect example of this model. Gum production is cheap, relying on common raw materials, but thanks to the strength of the brand, it sells with a high margin. Buffett himself joked that he had conducted a 70-year taste test of both companies and both passed. For Mars, it was an expensive but strategically necessary step. The terms of the loan from Buffett were harsh, with interest exceeding 11%, which earned the investor billions in profits in the following years. Mars did not hesitate, however. As soon as markets stabilized and the company generated enough cash, it began aggressively paying down its debt. In 2013, they bought out the bonds, and 3 years later they bought back his equity stake from Buffett as well. Thus, Mars became the largest confectionery company in the world, under whose roof M&M's and Snickers now met with brands like Orbit, Winterfresh, or Skittles. For the company management, however, this was not a mere victory in tables or a triumph over Hershey. It was another logical step in building a system that would be self-sufficient, stable, and widely straddled. A system that can withstand even a global economic storm if it has the right partners by its side. Looking at Mars today, we see a fascinating paradox. It is one of the largest private companies in the world, with an annual turnover exceeding $50 billion, a number by which it surpasses even Coca-Cola in sales. Its products are known by billions of people, yet the family that owns this colossus remains in complete seclusion, out of the spotlight, and without the obligation to answer to the public. From the outside, Mars acts like an industrial fortress, impenetrable, closed, stable, and yet it all started with a boy who couldn't run after the others, with a child who, instead of a backyard, knew a kitchen table and the smell of caramel. From those quiet hours with his mother emerged a man who fell all his life, got up again, and finally created a sweet that opened the world to him. And from him, then a son who rebuilt that world in his own way, hard, systematically, without sentiment, and turned the family trade into an invisible but vast empire that touches upon two of the most basic areas of human life, joy and care. Mars, in the end, is not a story about chocolate. It is a story about perseverance that survived even where others would have quit, about ambition that refused to accept boundaries, about how weakness can be the beginning of strength, and that sometimes those who let themselves be heard the least win the loudest.